Proclamation, like we mentioned, is a political maneuver by Abraham Lincoln to free the slaves in the South. It does not free the slaves in the border states, as that would make the border states leave the Union. So, in hopes that many African Americans in the South would abandon their slave plantations and try to find the closest Northern army and join, the ones that do, many decide to fight for the Union, and they become soldiers. So as Lincoln moved to emancipate the slaves, he took steps to enlist many blacks into the armed forces of the United States. And this is not a first. Many black people in the United States have served during the American Revolution, during the War of 1812, even though the official policy of the War Department was to refuse free Northern blacks who tried to serve as a volunteer. But as the war dragged on and manpower began to run significantly low, many black enlistees were accepted, sometimes over furious and ferocious protests from Northern whites. But by the end of the war, some 180,000 black men served in the Union Army. Most of them came from slave states. The majority were from slave states. In fact, we can say that blacks accounted for about 10% of total enlistments. So 1 out of 10 soldiers in the Union Army were African American. So the black men fighting were unquestionably had their hearts against the evil of slavery, and that the Civil War had become kind of a crusade against slavery by the end of the Civil War. It's not how it was at the beginning, but by the end of the Civil War, it was Lincoln's crusade against slavery. They wanted to have a chance to prove their manhood, and the Civil War granted them that opportunity. They felt like they had an opportunity to get full citizenship by the end of the war. And so many African Americans fought extremely brave during the American Civil War. In fact, 22 received Congressional Medals of Honor. That is the highest award that the United States military can give. Also, African American brigades were segregated. There were no white people fighting alongside the African Americans. So, as a result of this, their casualties were extremely heavy, meaning they were usually on the front, put in the front. And their casualties were very high. More than 38,000 died, whether that be from battle or sickness or, however they may die. Whenever Confederates did win a battle and they captured soldiers, took prisoners of war, white soldiers were captured and put in prisoner of war camps. Black soldiers often were just executed. This is obviously pretty terrible. One notorious case of this happened at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Several black soldiers were massacred here after they formally surrendered. They threw down their arms, formally surrendered, and then were still mercilessly executed. So for many in black regiments, they kind of had a battle cry which became, "Remember Fort Pillow." Kind of like their own little "Remember the Alamo." Remember Fort Pillow as they swung into battle. And then black regiments began to vow to take no prisoners as well. Now, for whatever reasons, the Confederacy, for the reasons of pride, principle, prejudice, racism, the Confederacy could never bring itself to enlist slaves until about a month before the war ended, and they absolutely were just desperate. And then it was too late. Okay? All right, look at this guy. What do you guys think? Can I pull off this facial hair? Definitely. Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that. His name is General Ambrose Burnside, and I bring up his facial hair because that's where we get what if a man grows his, the hair down on his cheeks very long. What is that called? Sideburns. It comes from his name because of his immaculate facial hair. Burnside, sideburns. That's where the name comes from. Okay, so after the Battle of Antietam, which took place in what state? It's north of Virginia. Maryland. After the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln replaces tardy George McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac with General Ambrose Burnside, whose ornate side whiskers came to be known as sideburns. Burnside proved, Burnside proved to not be a fantastic leader as well. And he proves it when he launches a rash attack on Lee's position at the Battle of Fredericksburg. In December of 1862. And this frontal attack on General Robert E. Lee at Fredericksburg was an absolute disaster for the Union. The Confederates had an elevated position. You always want to have the high ground whenever you're fighting. It's much easier to shoot down than it is to shoot up. And it was remarked by one of General Lee's commanders that a chicken could not even survive on that field. That's how well they had it covered with artillery and men. The men were they had a stone, literally like a wall of rock that they hid behind and shot behind.
This interruption. Zachariah Hugert, could you please come to the main office, please? Zachariah Hugert.
Okay. So that was, Ambrose Burnside definitely makes some mistakes at Fredericksburg. More mistakes even continue on at the Battle of Chancellorsville. As General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, who already earned war fame, has some misfortunes. And then I would pass these around. I can't pass them around. But these are Civil War bullets that were fired and found at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And I'll just kind of show them to you. These are called mini balls. Mini as in M-I-N-I, like with an E with a mark over it. It's a French word, minier. We call them mini balls because we're uncouth Americans. Minier balls. And you can see that they're not round like a musket ball. They have rifling on them. So they're fired from rifles and they spin. And they're much more accurate. But General Jackson at Chancellorsville, he was able to sneak up on General Hooker's men who were kind of camped out. And General Jackson leads his men through the woods, through the wilderness, on a path that many of nobody in the Union even knew about. But the South, this is their backyard, this is their home field, and so they knew about these deer paths and everything. And so they literally sneak, thousands of men sneak through the woods and then emerge from the wilderness into the campsite of the Union and attack them. And they attack them from the flank. So the strategy worked, and General Hooker, who was kind of dazed, he's a Union general, by the near hit from a cannonball, was badly beaten, but he was not crushed. So the victory at Chancellorsville was one of General Lee and General Jackson's most brilliant. But unfortunately, Jackson, after the evening of the battle, he's kind of out at night, just riding his horse around the edge of where the battle was fought, and he was shot mistakenly by one of his own men, and he gets shot in the arm, and he died a few days later from the gunshot wound, and then, he had to have his arm amputated because they had no real way of saving shattered bone. I just showed you that bullet. Those bullets don't go all the way through you. They go in, and if it hits bone, they're going to stay inside you, and it's like break the bone. So, had his arm removed. Massive loss for the South because of his brilliance. General Lee said, because Jackson got shot in the left arm, and when General Lee was asked of General Jackson, he said, General Jackson may have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right, because that was his right-hand man. Okay, so, but General Lee never thought he would die, but ultimately General Jackson does die from his wounds. Okay, so Lee is feeling good. We're getting victories at Fredericksburg, victories at Chancellorsville. He's feeling good. Okay, so Lee now prepared to follow up these victories by invading the North again. What happened the first time he tried to invade the North? What was that battle called? It happened in Maryland. The Battle of Antietam. So now Lee prepares to follow up by invading the North again. But this time, he's going to do it through Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania. And he believed that a decisive blow could add noise could help the South get some foreign assistance, foreign intervention. He could get some assistance from France, get some assistance from Great Britain. And also, the North, Abraham Lincoln is getting a lot of pressure from media. They're constantly putting pressure in Washington and Abraham Lincoln to have action. And by invading the North, that would put increasing pressure on Lincoln. So, the Union General George Meade replaces General Hooker. General Hooker, by the way, used to pay women to come and visit his men in camp, and that's where the name Hookers comes from, just so you know. But that's neither here nor there. But so General Meade, he has his men, and they're just kind of marching through Pennsylvania, and he decides that they're going to take a kind of a little break near a quiet little town called Gettysburg. And there in Gettysburg, he and his 92,000 men eventually met 76,000 of General Lee's men at the Battle of Gettysburg. Both sides heard that the town had a storage unit, not a storage unit, but a surplus of shoes. And they wanted to go and get the shoes because their shoes were old and tattered and worn, and they wanted new shoes. And both sides arrived there and ended up meeting in battle over 3 days from July the 1st to July the 3rd of 1863. And for 3 days of fighting, it was not known who would win until the very end. It came down to the last day, the last hour of the last day. It was in doubt until the very end. Ultimately, the deciding factor, which proved decisive in winning the Battle of Gettysburg, was Pickett's charge. It failed. And the failure of General George Pickett's magnificent and brave but futile charge, you know what futile means? Futile. It's futile. It's not going to do any good. Okay. His futile charge finally broke the attack. Finally broke the back of the Confederate attack. Okay, and broke the heart of the Confederate cause. George Pickett was a Confederate. He's a Confederate general. And he leads his men up this hill, and it was, if they were successful, they would win the Battle of Gettysburg. If they were unsuccessful, they would lose it, and they lost. So Pickett's charge, as it is now known, has kind of been called the high tide of the Confederacy. It defines the northernmost point reached by significant Southern force. That's the farthest the South ever invaded into the North. And it was really the last real chance the South had at winning the war, if they would have won this battle. But ultimately, they do not. And as the Battle of Gettysburg raged, a Confederate peace delegation was entering Washington, D.C. to negotiate cessation of hostilities. So, well, let's just go back to normal, okay? And Abraham Lincoln had them detained on his own word. Like, he just had them set aside. What would happen if they would negotiate a peace? This war had been going on for 2 years. Thousands of Americans have been killed. People are wanting peace. Why did Abraham Lincoln kind of hide them and not want to hear what they had to say? What would happen if they would have negotiated peace right there in 1863 after the Battle of Gettysburg? What would have happened? Slavery would still have been allowed to exist. They just wouldn't have been fighting anymore. And Abraham Lincoln, he said, we're going to have total victory. I'm going to set you guys, I know that peace is very popular. Everybody in America, Democrat, Republican, Whig, whatever, they all wanted peace. But Abraham Lincoln, in his wisdom and his bravery, says, this is not what is best. We will not listen to your peace negotiation. We will continue to have war if you're willing to fight it, and we will stomp out slavery. So the war, or the Battle of Gettysburg, was in July of 1863, and later in that same year, in the fall, Abraham Lincoln travels to Gettysburg to dedicate what became known as a cemetery there because of the massive casualties that occurred at Gettysburg. And at this dedication, he wrote a very brief speech. It was like 2 minutes long. And that speech is now known as the Gettysburg Address. And it was a big day. There was a speaker before him who literally spoke for 2 hours. For 2 hours, he spoke before Lincoln. And then he introduces Lincoln, and Lincoln speaks for 2 minutes. And then Lincoln sits down. And then the man who spoke for 2 hours gets up, and he says, President Lincoln, you have just said more in 2 minutes than I have in the last 2 hours. That was how poignant Abraham Lincoln's speech was. So, have you guys ever read the Gettysburg Address? Okay, good. All right. So it was really an emotional time. Emotionally uplifting, talking about how the people who on that battlefield gave the last full measure of devotion. They died for their country, and that their deaths will not happen in vain. That something is going to happen as a result of the sacrifices that they made at the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay? All right. Now, all that we've talked about so far is like what's going on in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Okay? There's also war raging in the West. And the person really in charge of the war in the West is Ulysses Simpson Grant, U.S. Grant, who's an interesting American character in history. mediocre student, graduated from West Point, along with Robert E. Lee. He did fairly well at math. He was a really good he excelled at horsemanship. He fought in the Mexican-American War. And really, the winning of the Mexican-American War so handily, he was like a sergeant or maybe a lieutenant. I think he was a lieutenant. And after the war, he was stationed at a post in this newly acquired land we got from Mexico. And that was it. That was it. No more fighting. And he was succumbed to boredom. And in his boredom, he began to drink. And he was a drunk. In fact, he was court-martialed for drunkenness. So, before his court-martial, he resigns. He quits before he is dishonorably discharged from the United States military. A man who later becomes a general. That's how bad our leadership was in the Union. Like, Burnside, bad. McClellan, bad. All these other guys, bad. Let's turn to the drunk. Like, this is what we got to do something. That's how bad the Union leadership was. So he resigns from the Army to avoid a court-martial from drunkenness, where he then returns home and works in his dad's leather store for $50 a month. So Grant himself, kind of silent, shy, little shopkeeper. He's stooped, he's awkward, sloppy in dress, smelled terrible because he constantly had a cigar in his mouth. But his when he is called upon to join the fighting during the Civil War, he answers the call, and due to his military experience, which was good, but his military experience combined with his boldness, his resourcefulness, and his tenacity put him on a meteoric rise in the United States military during the Civil War. Grant's first success in the Civil War came in Tennessee. After heavy fighting, he's able to capture Fort Donelson, Fort Henry. These are on the Tennessee rivers, Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. When he met with the Confederate commanders after those two battles, and they wanted to negotiate peace talks after those battles, Ulysses S. Grant's simple response was an immediate and unconditional surrender. You will completely surrender. And so that's where he gets kind of the nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, U.S. Grant. So that's why a lot of times he's referred to simply as U.S. Grant. So Grant's triumph in Tennessee was crucial, very crucial. And Lincoln resisted all demands for removing Unconditional Surrender Grant, insisting he can't spare this man, even when he receives reports that Grant was drinking again. And when Lincoln receives these reports that he's drinking again, he responds by saying, "Find me the brand he drinks and I'll send it to all my generals," because U.S. Grant was getting results. He was winning. Abraham Lincoln, kind of a funny guy. Okay? So, essentially, U.S. Grant gets several more victories throughout the South, like the Battle of Vicksburg, which was located on a hairpin turn in the Mississippi River, a fort at Vicksburg. And it was really the South's final protective fort, protecting the lifeline between the west of the Mississippi River, like Texas and Arkansas, to it was like their grain supply. And so Grant really does a lot to take over the Mississippi River. Is that part of the Anaconda Plan? Yes, it is definitely because you're going to cut the South in half. And General Grant does a lot to do that. Along with his friend, William Tecumseh Sherman. Look at this guy. That's not a face you want to see in a back alley, is it? All right. After Grant's victories along the Mississippi rivers, throughout Tennessee, throughout Kentucky, throughout the West, he then entrusts the invasion of Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina to William and Tecumseh Sherman, which is also part of the Anaconda Plan. William Tecumseh Sherman, red-haired, grim-faced, and ruthless. He captured the city of Atlanta in September of 1864. Fairly easily. He occupied it and then ordered the city to be burned to the ground. Before the battle? After the battle. Why? Not only does Sherman and Grant want to win the war, they want to break the will of Southerners to ever want to fight again. Because when they're burning the city down, yeah, they're harming their war effort, but they're also burning down people's homes, citizens. Like they took the war to the citizenry to make the citizens want the war to stop. Total war. And this became the policy of William Tecumseh Sherman's entire trek through the South. Burning buildings, tearing up railroads, as you can see by this picture on the bottom left. What they would do is they would heat the railroad tracks until they were red hot and then twist them into iron donuts. They called them Sherman donuts. See what they're doing there? They're twisting the railroad track. Obviously, can you use that anymore for trains? No. I mean, train could go across it once. It's not going to go very far. Okay? So, by destroying the railroad tracks in the South, they're no longer able to move men, machines, supplies, food to much needed crucial places. So he literally is taking the war to the Confederate citizens' homes. And his methods were brutal. I mean, they were brutal. His men, after a battle was over, after they took a city, he would be like, go take what you want, guys. Go get it. And they would. They would take possessions. They would take women that they found. Not like take them with them, but like take them. You know what I'm saying? Rape. Pillaging, like Genghis Khan style. This was an American doing this to Americans. But this war had been going on for 4 years, and he felt like this was necessary. And it wasn't just Georgia. He did this throughout South Carolina. And is wildly successful in his brutal methods. Okay. All right. More snake talk. A lot of snake talk. We got an Anaconda Plan. We got copperheads. What's a copperhead? A copperhead is a nickname given to Northern Democrats who were willing to settle for a negotiated peace with the South. So these are the people that would allow slavery to continue as long as there was peace. And they were Democrats in the North. Now the Democrats were lacking leadership as Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant, dies during the Civil War. He dies about 7 weeks after the war begins He dies of typhoid fever, actually. So, lacking effective leadership, the Democrats were divided. There were a large number of war Democrats that supported President Lincoln's administration. What party was President Lincoln? What party was President Lincoln? He was a Republican. He had the support of Northern Democrats. Okay? Peace Democrats, or the Copperheads, did not support President Lincoln. Why were they called Copperheads? What is a Copperhead? You guys should know. You guys live here. You know what Copperheads are. What are they?
Snakes.
They are snakes. Dangerous snakes? Why are they dangerous? They're poisonous. And they're poisonous and they're poisonous and they don't have a rattle. You know, like a rattlesnake, they'll rattle before they bite. Will a copperhead rattle? No. And that's why these people are called copperheads, because they openly obstructed the war through attacks like the draft. What happens if there's no draft? Then there's not a lot of people to fight. No men to fight. No war to be won. They were against emancipation. So a lot of the core ideas of Abraham Lincoln, they opposed and fought against him openly. And they used a lot of harsh language when talking about the president. They called him the Illinois ape, fighting his inward war. That's what they called it, saying that we don't want to free the slaves. We want to keep the black people oppressed. So notorious among the Copperheads was a congressman from Ohio named Clement Vallandigham. Clement Vallandigham. Clement Vallandigham. 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 A pretty tempestuous character. Brilliant orator, meaning he gave great speeches. And he had an unusual talent for stirring up trouble. He demanded that President Lincoln end this cruel and wicked war immediately. Thousands of American boys have died. But Abraham Lincoln is able to withstand the barrage from the war Democrats, the Copperheads, and keep them from striking distance by retaining Republican support from the threat of peace Democrats and Copperheads. Because all of these things are campaign issues during the presidential election of 1864, which occurs during the Civil War. The war is still being fought, and there is a presidential election to be had. Now, you'll notice on this electoral college map on the top left that many of the states are gray. Why? They're not part of the United States in 1864, and so therefore they are not voting. So, fearing defeat, the Republican Party executed a very clever maneuver in this election, and they join with the war Democrats. Those are not Copperheads. That's the anti-Copperheads. Thus, the Republican Party kind of passes out of existence and proclaims itself to be the Union Party. Lincoln chooses as his running mate a man by the name of Andrew Johnson, who is not a Republican. He's a war Democrat from Tennessee who stays loyal to the Union. Andrew Johnson owned slaves. Not a lot, but one's too many, I guess. One's too many. But he had been a small slave owner when the war started, and he hoped to kind of smooth things over between voters in the border states, seeing that Abraham Lincoln could get along with someone with Southern sympathies. And the So you got Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson on one side, and then the guy who has been like the thorn in Abraham Lincoln's side since the beginning of the war runs against him, George McClellan, Tardy George. So he runs on the Democratic platform, and he has all the Copperhead support. General McClellan. The campaign itself was pretty nasty. The Democrats cried, "Old Abe removed McClellan. Now we'll remove Old Abe." And another campaign slogan was like, "Mac will win back the Union." Pretty slick. Abraham Lincoln's campaign slogan, a little less catchy: "Don't swap horses in the middle of a river." What does that mean? Don't swap horses in the middle of a river. What happens if you try to get off your horse in the middle of a river? You could drown. What is that supposed to mean for his campaign? Don't choose another president during this war. Choose me, or you'll drown. Okay? Don't swap horses in the middle of a river. Okay? So Lincoln's re-election was at first kind of in doubt. But ultimately, we all know what happens. He wins. He wins. And he wins pretty handily. Pretty handily. As you can see by the electoral map at the top left. He wins 212 to 21 electoral college votes. He also wins the popular vote by 300,000. 300,000. So, if Lincoln had been defeated, what might have happened? If the Copperheads would have gotten their way, the war would have ended and slavery could have been allowed to persist. So the re-election of Lincoln really sets in stone. That is really the last ghost of hope for the Confederacy to have any semblance of victory whatsoever. And so he is re-elected, and it's over. Okay? It's over. Once Lincoln wins, desertions from the shrinking ranks of the Confederate Army skyrocket. I mean, people just abandon it. They go home. They go back to their small farms, and it's essentially over. Essentially. Does that mean it's over? There's still fighting to be done, and a lot more battles to come. Okay? But ultimately, the North wins as U.S. Grant and the Union Army are able to outlast Robert E. Lee. Grant was brought in from the West to replace General Meade in his poor leadership. Lincoln felt he needed a general who employed superior resources, which the North had, and had the guts, the intestinal stamina, the guts to drive forward into Southern territory and basically chase Robert E. Lee. And he engaged Lee in a series of very furious battles, which what is now known as the Wilderness Campaign. The Wilderness Campaign. And the rate of loss to Robert E. Lee's army versus the rate of loss to General Grant's army was 1 casualty for every 5 soldiers, whereas Grant lost 1 for every 10. So he's literally losing twice as many troops in a ratio. Okay, they don't have as many. If you have 10 and I have 20, and you lose one thing and I lose one thing, you've lost double what I've lost. Okay, so it's pretty brutal arithmetic. But Grant knew that he was going to win. All he had to do was engage. If he stayed on the attack, he knew that Lee would eventually run out of men. Now, he knew a lot of men are going to die, including his. But math is math. If he loses one for every one that I lose, I will win. Pretty brutal arithmetic. But it works. And the end came with a pretty dramatic suddenness. Rapidly advancing Northern troops capture the city of Richmond, burn it to the ground, as what had become protocol. And General Grant finally catches up with Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April of 1865, where these two men meet on Palm Sunday and generate some terms of surrender in Wilmer McLean's house, the man whose house it was where the first shots of the Battle of Bull Run in his front yard were fired. And the terms of surrender, in a word we could call generous. Generous. General Grant had nothing but respect for Robert E. Lee. And ultimately, the war came to an end once these men signed the terms of surrender. Lincoln traveled to the conquered city of Richmond and even sat at the desk of Jefferson Davis just 40 hours after Jefferson Davis had evacuated the city. When he heard Dixie being played through the streets of Richmond, many of his soldiers lifted their guns to stop the people from playing, and he said, "No, it's quite a nice tune." Dixie was like the song of the South, okay? So he thanked God that he was able to see the end of it, and he lived to see the end of it. Unfortunately, bad things are coming in the future for Abraham Lincoln. And that's what we'll talk about next time.